Throughout the history of the Roman Republic and Empire, at least 30 civil wars were fought. Some of the most famous ones were between Marius and Sulla, Caesar and Pompey, but arguably the most famous one, and the one we will be discussing in this video, was the one between Octavian and Marc Antony. With the assassination of Julius Caesar in 44 BC, the Roman Republic was split into three parts. One led by Caesar's chosen heir and great-nephew Octavian, a powerful general and close friend of Caesar named Marc Antony, and a Roman statesman named Lepidus. Marc Antony was a close friend of Caesar and served as a general in his army during his conquest of Gaul between 58 and 50 BC. After the war was over, Caesar sent Antony back to Rome to serve as a political ally against increasingly hostile figures in the Senate, and when the Senate expelled Antony, Caesar used this as part of his reasonings to cross the Rubicon. Throughout his entire life, Antony was one of Caesar's closest friends, and when Caesar died, Marc Antony was assigned to the eastern provinces of the empire. This is where he met Cleopatra, who was the queen of Egypt in 41 BC. Cleopatra seduced Marc Antony like she did Caesar before him to secure her throne in Egypt's borders. Marc Antony also needed Egypt for a source of funds and supplies. Octavian was born in 63 BC into a wealthy family and was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. His father was a Roman governor but died when Octavian was only 4 years old. Octavian impressed the great Julius Caesar when he survived being shipwrecked and crossing enemy territory to safely make it to Caesar's camp. Having no true sons of his own, Caesar named Octavian as his beneficiary. When Caesar was assassinated, Octavian was undergoing military training in Apollonia. Despite both having a good relationship with Caesar, relations began to strain between Marc Antony and Octavian, so Marc Antony married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in 40 BC, but this does not help, and they separate in 37 BC. Cleopatra bore Marc Antony twins, and they allegedly got married, which was illegal under Roman law, as Romans were not allowed to marry foreigners, and Marc Antony was still married to Octavian's sister, despite being separated, which was a massive insult. After a successful military campaign in Armenia, Marc Antony had a triumph procession in Alexandria, Egypt, where he and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones, and their kids were given royal titles in 34 BC. This enraged many people in Rome, as they saw this as a betrayal for Marc Antony because it looked like he was delivering the Republic into foreign hands and moving the center of power from Rome to Egypt. After years of propaganda and tension, Octavian declares war on Cleopatra in 32 BC. His main quarrel was with Marc Antony, but he declared war on Cleopatra because he knew the Roman public did not want another civil war, but he also knew that Marc Antony would come to Cleopatra's defense. And just as Octavian predicted, Marc Antony threw his support to his lover Cleopatra. After this, the Senate stripped Antony of his official power and labeled him as a traitor and outlaw. Many of Marc Antony's rivals joined Octavian's side of the war, but roughly 40% of the Senate, as well as both serving councils, sided with Marc Antony and joined him in Greece to prepare for battle. Marc Antony's brilliance as a military commander scored him early victories in the war. By 31 BC, Marc Antony had positioned himself in Greece, with Octavian crossing the Adriatic Sea to meet him. Octavian, however, does not rush to face Marc Antony and prefers a war of attrition until he can meet Marc Antony at sea, where he would have the upper hand with his experienced sailors. Octavian's trusted commander and childhood friend Agrippa disrupted Marc Antony's supply lines, demoralizing his camp and causing more and more of Antony's soldiers to desert. On September 2nd, 31 BC, Octavian and Marc Antony's fleets then met off the coast of Actium in the Ionian Sea. Though Marc Antony commanded some larger ships, the majority of his vessels were similar in size to Octavian's fleet, but Marc Antony's fleet was undermanned due to desertion and a malaria outbreak. Octavian also had more vessels than Marc Antony, with 400 ships, compared to Marc Antony and Cleopatra's fleet, numbering about 250. During the battle, Antony arranged his ships in two lines. The majority of his ships were in the front line, with Cleopatra's Egyptian ships in the rear. The battle between Octavian's forces and Marc Antony's forces was fierce and in a deadlock when Cleopatra and her ships suddenly darted to the open sea when it was clear that Marc Antony was not going to score a quick early victory. Marc Antony then transfers to a smaller vessel and flees the battle with Cleopatra. Marc Antony's forces continued to fight on, but Octavian's forces eventually won the battle. With total victory in sight, Octavian invades Egypt in 30 BC. Marc Antony, Cleopatra, and the remaining soldiers meet Octavian at Alexandria on July 1st, 30 BC. Despite losing a large chunk of his forces at Actium, Antony initially holds strong and defeats Octavian's first invasion, but as more and more of his soldiers begin to desert, his defense begins to falter. Octavian then begins a second invasion in early August 30 BC, and this one is successful. With the dual attack from the east and west, the city of Alexandria falls. 9 days later, Mark Antony and Cleopatra decide to end their lives. Octavian annexes Egypt and then executes Mark Antony's eldest son, Antilius, and Caesarion, who was the alleged son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra. With the defeat and death of Mark Antony, Octavian would now rule Rome. Octavian transforms Rome into an empire and becomes its first emperor, Augustus Caesar. If Mark Antony would have won, it is very likely Egypt would have become the new center of power in the Mediterranean. Without Octavian, his conquest and reorganization of the Republic into an empire, European and world history is completely different, and Rome may have never risen to the heights it did in our timeline. Thank you.